All right, welcome back to our series, The Architecting of Bitcoin Credit Markets. We're now on to episode 5, where we're going to discuss a lot about trust and governance. Up until this point, we've kind of described this architecture that can use DeFi or decentralized finance to rebuild Bitcoin-backed credit on-chain. Unfortunately, DeFi isn't always that decentralized, right? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors that kind of puts forward this facade that it is, there's no trust involved and there's no intermediaries. But if you pull back the curtain, it's actually just decentralized in name only, right? Or Dino. And so the intention of this whiteboard is to really kind of go through this architecture we've been describing, which is Morpho V2, and show where it is credibly decentralized and then where some amount of trust is unavoidable, but what mechanisms are used to clamp down on that pretty significantly. Before we get into the whiteboard, I'll say that there's typically 3 things that you want to assess when kind of questioning the trust of these setups. One is the protocol itself. So like Morpho V2, how decentralized is that actually? The second thing is the asset. So even if Morpho is totally decentralized, the asset you're using inside of Morpho, is it wrapped WBTC custodied by BitGo? Is it CBBTC custodied by Coinbase? Is it some sort of novel cryptographic bridge like a ZK rollup on Bitcoin? We want to understand the trust assumptions of the asset in addition to the protocol itself. And then the last one, which can apply to both of these, is the upgradability, where it's like very often when building things on chain, there's usually like an upgradability aspect where somebody can plug in a key and basically change the rules of the game. And so understanding like, does upgradability exist? If it does, what limitations does it have on that power? If you understand these 3 things in any setup, you have a pretty good idea of what level of trust you're taking on by interacting with these protocols. Okay, so I'm going to recap Morpho V2 very briefly, and then we're going to describe where the trust vectors essentially exist here. So as a reminder, Morpho kind of has borrowers up here, and they can allocate their dollars into these things that we call vaults, and vaults can be set up by anyone, and the vaults can say, hey, we're going to take these dollars and maybe we're going to put them into these different markets, and maybe this here is like a variable interest rate market, and this one is like a fixed market, and then you have borrowers down here, okay? And the borrowers can say, great, I want to, post my Bitcoin as collateral and borrow at a variable interest rate, or I want to, borrow at a fixed interest rate. The way that these borrowers, from a Bitcoin perspective, have to get their Bitcoin into the protocol is they have to go over some sort of bridge. And so maybe here you have some sort of like custodial setup. And here you have some sort of non-custodial setup. Okay. And that's how the borrowers access their Bitcoin inside of this. Okay. So the first thing to start here before we go through where the trust exists in vaults and markets and bridge is Morpho V2 itself is immutable. Okay. But you could think of Morpho as just the scaffolding or the building blocks. It's saying, look, we're giving the building blocks for anyone else to kind of build their on-chain borrowing and lending experience, right? So the building blocks themselves are immutable and cannot be changed. There's no upgradability associated with that. But with those building blocks, somebody could create their own vault. They could click this plus sign here and they create their own vault. And that vault has certain rules which may be able to be changed and introduce some amount of trust, right? So to start, the components of the vaults that cannot be changed is kind of the core custody. This is immutable. And so an example would be here. It's like, if I put money, like $100 into a vault that has $1,000 total, they can't just change the rules to say, oh, actually, we now own that. Like there's a different private key that can, unlock and access those funds. Or another example would be, again, if I put in $100 and there's $1,000 in their total, they can't change the accounting rules to say, yeah, you used to own 10% of this vault, but now you own 0%. It's like the core custody and ownership of these vaults like is immutable and can't be manipulated. All right. The things that can be changed are like the risk parameters. Okay. Because these vaults, they're allocating money into these different markets. A vault may say, hey, we're putting 50% of the user's funds into these variable interest rate loans. and then maybe 50% into the fixed rate loans. Like the kind of parameters of what the vault is allowed to allocate to, those just have to be able to get upgraded and changed. Like the vaults have to be able to compete and modify their risk parameters. So again, they can't change the custody of it, but they can adjust these risk parameters. So that could be something like, like the loan to value that they're willing to, or different markets. Okay. Now, these risk parameters are usually protected, where they have to have some sort of time lock. Okay. So if a vault wants to change some of its risk parameters, it says, we want to take on riskier loans. We want to start loaning at a higher loan to value, which could put more of the funds at risk, but it allows us to make more money. Maybe they propose that change, and then it takes a week for that to actually go into effect. So that would be public, and the LPs could, in theory, have the opportunity to remove their funds or change it. If they're not paying attention during the time lock, then the change can go into effect. That is one of the vectors of trust that LPs are kind of taking by putting it into a vault. There's also usually some sort of, I think they call it a sentinel role here, where maybe there is a separate entity that's almost like a council that can say, hold on, there's some sort of risk parameter that's being changed here. The sentinel can just block it, right? They can say, hey, this looks malicious, we're going to block it. Maybe the sentinel role can't actually propose risk changes itself. It can't do anything except just block potentially a malicious thing. So there are protections like this where it says, look, the core custody can't be changed. That's the most important part. The risk parameters, yes, they can be changed, but we can add these time locks on them that kind of protect users. If something is happening that they don't like, they can exit. And then you have these sentinel roles that can kind of play a defensive posture. So the trust assumptions with vaults really only affect the lenders themselves, right? Not the borrowers, okay? Where borrowers can start to get potentially affected is the market. It's like once the borrower posts their Bitcoin as collateral, they're receiving funds from the lenders or the vaults. There's two major vectors of trust that you have to be concerned about. One is the oracle, and the other is the liquidation. Okay. So once collateral is locked into a market, say I put $100 of Bitcoin, I borrowed $50 of some sort of stable coin, there has to be a price feed or an oracle, right? And so each market can be configured with whatever oracle they want. So you could say, I want Chainlink over here, I want Redstone over here. Maybe we want a different fixed rate market that uses, Chaos Labs oracle. And if the oracle submits a bad price feed, that could lead to an improper liquidation. Now, in reality, oracles have proven to be quite robust. I think they've secured many, many billions, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars or more, a lot. And as far as I know, there's never been any sort of major oracle breakdowns when it comes to a Bitcoin price feed, which is extremely well established. There have been kind of fringe long tail assets that nobody's ever heard of that have had bad price feeds. But I think oracles have proven to be the major credible ones have proven to be quite robust. But still, oracles are a potential risk. And it's also worth considering that oracles probably would have some sort of upgradability where maybe Chainlink by default, goes and gets price feeds of Bitcoin from, hundreds of different places, and, it removes the outliers, and it has this very efficient process for getting the best price feed. But does it probably have some sort of upgradability, like a multi-sig behind the scenes that could upgrade the price feed? Yeah. And so I'm pretty sure that's all that other oracles work as well. And so that is a trade-off that you're kind of just putting in the oracle. And so it's important to kind of understand that if you are lending money into a market or you're borrowing dollars against it, is there a credible oracle price feed? The other thing that you're trusting here is that if you're a lender and the price goes down and the oracle is functioning properly, but the loan is potentially at risk of going underwater, you're kind of trusting that there will be actors that will come in and be economically incentivized to basically trigger the liquidation, to sell some of the collateral to cover the loan. So you are putting some trust that there's just there's plenty of economic actors that are willing to perform the liquidation. If you're on like a credible chain and there's lots of activity, I'd say this is like pretty low risk. So that's kind of vaults and then markets. Now we get to, I think, kind of the most difficult problem to solve, but that we may finally have a solution for, which is the bridge, right? In Bitcoin, on Bitcoin layer 1, it's notoriously difficult. Like, you can't have these expressive, programmatic contracts, right? That's why Ethereum and Solana and all this stuff was born. It's like, you can't do this on Bitcoin. So, come use Ethereum or, Solana and just bridge your Bitcoin into those ecosystems, right? And so, unfortunately, the only way that if you want to bridge your Bitcoin from the layer 1 into something like Morpho V2 that exists on, say, Ethereum, right now, you have to do that using a custodial setup, right? So this could be an entity like Coinbase or BitGo. And you basically give your Bitcoin to these custodians, and then they mint a wrapped or a derivative version of the Bitcoin on the chain that uses Morpho V2. So maybe that's CBBTC from Coinbase and WBTC from BitGo. These have so far proven to be like very credible custodians, but you just don't know for sure. It's like, are they fractionally reserving on the back end? Maybe they lost the keys. Maybe the government could one day come in and seize those assets. I think so far to date, these, again, have proven to be like pretty credible providers, but you just don't know. And trusting them is a bit antithetical to the whole movement of Bitcoin, of not your keys, not your coins. Okay. So I think that brings us to the non-custodial side, which for us at Alpen is like much more exciting, which is like, can we actually build these cryptographic bridges where you don't have to rely on a trusted intermediary to bridge your Bitcoin into these ecosystems? And over the past couple of years, there's been breakthroughs in our ability to kind of create these non-custodial bridges from the Bitcoin layer 1 to the Bitcoin layer 2. And so the most popular method to do this is something called a ZK rollup on Bitcoin. Okay. So I've done a lot of videos that are much more detailed on this topic, but I'll try to give the abbreviated version, which is that Ethereum kind of pioneered this concept of a ZK rollup, which allows you to build a expressive layer 2 with a trustless bridge that allows you to bridge from the layer 1 into the layer 2, again, without trusting an intermediary like Coinbase or BitGo. Several years ago, it was discovered that this is theoretically possible to do on Bitcoin. And then a researcher by the name of Robin Linus came up with this idea called BitVM, which people may have heard of. Okay. And BitVM allows us to hack in some sort of ZK verification into the Bitcoin layer 1. And if Bitcoin can verify these zero knowledge proofs, then what you can do is you can have a setup like Morpho V2 on a layer 2. You can compress that into this thing called a zero knowledge proof, which is like a succinct, unforgeable digital receipt. And then you can settle that into Bitcoin, which gives us this kind of trustless bridge. Okay. There have been many iterations on top of Bitcoin, and the name has kind of changed where, we at Alpen, we now call it Glock. Okay. Short for garbled locks. But functionally, this kind of family of products, whether it's BitVM or Glock, allows you to have what's called a 1 of n trust assumption. And this means that you could have a bunch of entities, maybe it's 10, 15, 100. And as long as one entity is honest, then the bridge is essentially non-custodial, or it's safe and the funds can't be stolen. So again, if we have 100 entities and 99 of them are colluding together and trying to steal the funds, as long as there's one honest entity, even if it's like a small random, anonymous person, as long as that person is honest, then the bridge is essentially secure. So is this setup perfectly 100% cryptographically trustless? No. But is it like very, very, very good and very trust minimized? Yes. In my opinion, it's the highest security, lowest trust bridge that can technically be built without a soft fork to Bitcoin. So this, in my opinion, is the most exciting setup for Bitcoin-backed credit markets because, again, it gives us this kind of optimal architecture of Morpho V2, which I think is the best way to build on-chain credit. with the lowest trust assumptions on your Bitcoin collateral. And because you have the lowest trust assumptions, this would probably be priced the best, where you kind of get the best economic terms for borrowing against your Bitcoin and creating these Bitcoin-backed credit products. Okay. The one other caveat that I want to mention here is that this bridge right here would likely have some form of upgradability to it. Okay. Where BitVM and Glock can be just code, and it can be, fully open source, and it can be secured just by the cryptography itself. But some of that is still a bit unproven. And there likely would be some form of upgradability, almost like as a defense mechanism, where if God forbid, something happened, there was some sort of hack, that there would be some sort of upgradability multisig that can step in and kind of block the malicious withdrawals, or just improve the bridge. This bridge could potentially be upgraded, but there would be a bunch of defense mechanisms, like it being time locked, where if some sort of change is trying to be made to the bridge, maybe it would take, 2 or 3 weeks for that change to actually go through. It would be fully out in the open and transparent. People could flag it and say, hey, somebody is trying to change this bridge maliciously. But there would kind of be this time lock that could allow users to withdraw, or allow that change to essentially be blocked. So the default behavior is this one of n, which is the highest security and lowest trust that you can possibly get. There is this path for upgradability, but it's very much gated by time locks, and then something similar like this Sentinel type rule. Okay. Okay. So that is kind of the lay of the land. Let's see if I forgot anything. So yeah, the core primitives in Morpho v2 are immutable. You have these vaults which users can opt into. So you are taking some risk here with the risk parameters being able to change, but they're pretty well kind of gated with time locks and sentinels. We have oracles and liquidations on this market level. And then I'd say the biggest trust assumption is really deciding whether you want to use a custodial wrapped version of Bitcoin using like Coinbase or BitGo, or these more non-custodial setups that kind of use this technology called ZK rollups on Bitcoin. All right, so that should cover all the kind of risks so far. Oh, something I forgot to mention is that in prior episodes, we kind of described other DeFi architecture outside of Morpho v2 to build these credit markets. And so if you are using things like, a different DEX or a different borrowing and lending protocol or some other aspect of DeFi, you would kind of have to re-audit or re-vet those protocols and understand what potential trust assumptions exist. But for the core kind of Morpho v2, this is how we think about the trust. So, all right, that's the video, and tune in next time. We only have 2 more videos left. Thanks.